Okay, shh. It's 10 after, and congratulations on having survived the transition to standard time from daylight savings time. Okay, and I want to start with a couple of announcements, and then I have quite a long lecture, so let me be efficient. First, tomorrow is election day. Got to vote. Okay, so very, 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 very important. Do not forget, do not blow off this responsibility. There are critical elections, ballot propositions, and so forth in California. If they lose by one vote and it's the fault of my class, I'm going to shoot myself. Okay, so don't do it. Second, the paper assignment. I emailed it last night. It's posted on the website. I did not print enough copies for everyone, but you should be able to get it at home. But I want to say a word or two about it now, and then I will say more later. It's set up so that you interview two people. We've arranged it so that it is possible, if you live nearby and are going to go home or to visit family for Thanksgiving, you could potentially do the interviews over the break. If you are from abroad and you do not have family and you do not know anyone here, it would be, I think, ideal to find a friend who had family in the area and would be willing to let you interview a couple of members of his or her extended network. Now, this is interesting in one respect, which is it is certainly ideal, more than ideal, wonderful, wonderful if you can find people you're not related to or neighbors with or something to interview. But that might require, since you are supposed to get two interviewees who differ, at least plausibly by something that might be called social class. Now, since not many of us know super wealthy capitalists and some of us don't know real blue collar or low wage service workers, it can be hard to find such people. But I will just say that if you don't know anyone to interview and you want to try interviewing a stranger, which is in some ways a better research experience, right? It's harder to get the person to talk to you, but you might learn more. There is BART, you can take it, and if you take the Pittsburgh Bay Point line, there are all sorts of upper middle class communities out that way, like Orinda is the closest one. And after Orinda, you get to Walnut Creek, and Walnut Creek has big shopping centers with very well-to-do people strolling around shopping at Nordstrom and higher end places that I don't even know the names of, but you would find them. And then there are the people who work there, who might be some of the low-wage retail people you were looking for. So Broadway Shopping Center, which is a little bit of a walk or bus ride from the BART station, would be a great place to potentially recruit interviewees. The other thing is that we've asked you to try to find interviewees who are similar, and again, this wouldn't be identical, but similar along every dimension but class. So if you interview an Asian American businesswoman in her 40s who's married and has kids, try to interview an Asian American, garment worker in her 40s with kids. Now, of course, these things won't be exact. And if you're using your family network to recruit interviewees, you may even learn something by what's in your network and what isn't. So if you're from an upper middle class background, you literally might not know anyone who's working class, which would be one reason you might believe that effort is what makes a difference in life, because all the people you see already have a lot of advantages, and so what differentiates them is effort, right? And similarly, if you are from a working class family in Hayward, you might not know anyone as a family friend who is wealthier, although you might have a physician or someone in your network. So this requires a little bit of creativity. The other thing is, if you use someone like a parent, an aunt, an uncle, a family friend, you must actually interview the person as if you didn't know much about her or him, and you will find out that there are many, many questions children do not normally ask their parents about how they grew up, about how much money they had when they were a kid, and certain things are kind of family myth and you might know about them, and lots of other things you won't know. So I'm telling you to take the interview part very seriously, and then we'll talk more, but as you'll see if you read the assignment carefully, which I urge you to do, don't wait till you're actually doing the paper. Read it now, let it sink in, kind of let it marinate your brain a little bit. Think about it that way. You will realize that the most important core part of this is to try to figure out what you really mean by class with respect to your interviews, and to recognize that since we've dealt with different definitions of class, you want to think about the people you interview in terms of each of those definitions. And so that should set up the way you structure the interview in the first place. So you'll work in section and work on your own to devise some kind of a questionnaire, and you want to think about the different ways of measuring class. That's really the key. Okay, so that's, I said the elections, and I said the paper assignment. Now I'm going to go to this week. And this week you are reading a wonderful book, Preschool in Three Cultures, which, as you know from my email, the bookstore ordered the wrong book. So you have to read it from the B-Space online version. And the reason there's confusion is the following. This book is such a classic that the first author, the person who'd been the core of the original research, and two new collaborators went back and redid the same study 20 years later. So they had done the original study in Japan, in the US, and in China, and they went back to a much wealthier, more dynamic China, and to Japan, and to the Hawaiian preschool they had originally studied, to see how things were similar or different, and to follow up on some of the children and so forth. So the problem is that there are two books with very similar names, Preschool in Three Cultures and Preschool in Three Cultures Revisited, that are totally different books. It's not like it's the original book, but they added 30 pages at the end to kind of summarize. They are totally different. The Revisited book is a completely new, very interesting book, but that's not the book I assigned. I assigned the original Preschool in Three Cultures plus one photocopied chapter from the Revisited book, because I thought that the treatment of China in the first book was not as satisfying as the treatment of the US and Japan, and because I thought that China had changed so much that it actually was very interesting to read the second book's treatment of China. So basically, you deal with China twice, Japan and the US once. And what this book raises in a very fascinating way is the question of what we mean by culture and how different cultures differ. So Preschool in Three Cultures basically shows you three different societies' ways of thinking about how you should rear children, which have very much to do with what they conceive a person to be, what do they think a person is, what's the essential, necessary thing that makes a person, and how are people joined together in societies. And with little children, it's a kind of wonderful thing. Adults project their own moral understandings, their own sort of deep cultural understandings onto children. Those are the beings that they, in a sense, it's socialization from the other side, not how is the person getting socialized, which we talked about early in the course, but how are adults trying to socialize children? And in the very striking differences between the American, the Japanese, and the Chinese preschool, you see very different conceptions of what a person is and what a person needs to learn to become an adequate social being. And you'll see that in the American preschool, it's very fundamental to their conception of what a person is that children learn to choose. Now, that's not all they want them to learn, but basically there is an enormous emphasis on some kind of autonomous actor who can learn to choose. in the Japanese preschool, you will see that there is an enormous emphasis on people learning. The term they use is amai, which means something like emotional dependence on others, or attachment to the group, or attachment to others. And if you don't have that, you can't be a good person, because you can't be connected to what the group needs from you, right? You've got to have this emotional connection, or you're not really a person. Now, if you think about it, those of you who are either American born or are learning American culture, you may be caught between an ethic of mutual dependence and an ethic that says you're autonomous, you should choose everything for yourself, you should make all your own decisions, you should not need to listen to anyone else. And then the Chinese case is fascinating, partly because, at least in my reading of it, there is no essential nature of the person that the Chinese are trying to build, but they have a very strong sense that both there is a danger of excess selfishness and greed. So they want to teach children, especially spoiled children from the one-child family, not to be too selfish, and that it's the job of the collectivity, it's the job of the school to suppress selfishness and to teach children gratitude, which it's assumed they would not learn in their families. So the school sees itself as a kind of complement to and corrective to the dangers of excess selfishness, and a need to teach people their relationship to and their commitment to and their need to, achieve and sacrifice on behalf of the larger society. And I think if you looked at what's happening in China right now, the enormous debates about corruption, about the role of the party, about the success of the economy, about the powerful achievements of the Chinese as a nation, you would see almost those same debates being played out in the large political context. It's the exact same thing. Will we be dragged down by selfishness, or will we as a nation achieve the enormous heights that we are capable of? So this book is a really great book, and that's why I've gone to all the trouble of putting together different parts of it, so I want you to read it. That's the basic message here, is do not neglect your work just because we are having spring in the middle of November, which I don't take to be a good sign overall. Okay, global warming. Okay, and what I'm going to talk about today is the very important contribution to the question of how modern individualism in its Western form. So there is, believe it or not, individualism in Japan of a very creative, amazing sort. There is lots of individualism in China. So it's just not true that there's individualism in the West and not elsewhere. That is not historically true at all. But there is a distinctive kind of modern Western individualism that you see one thread of in these American preschools, these little tiny human beings like that who are supposed to show how autonomous and individual they are and how they can choose and they have their own preferences about everything. I don't know, again, how many of you are visitors from abroad, but people I know who've come from Asia say that one of the weirdest things about being in America, they get there, their English isn't all that great, sit down in an inexpensive restaurant, and what do they have to do? They're asked, what kind of bread do you want that on? Whole wheat, rye, sourdough, blah, 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 blah. Well, what kind of dressing do you want on your salad? Blue cheese, oil and vinegar, vinaigrette, balsamic, blah, 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 mustard, blah, blah, honey, yeah. And then what kind of potatoes do you want? French fries, home fries, blah, 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 blah. And it's like choosing is some kind of ridiculous ritual that is just central to what Americans think they're doing. And again, most places in the world, you go to a really good restaurant in Japan, you don't choose at all. They intuit what you want and give it to you. And that's that. So, yeah, you should enjoy this, think about it, and so forth. All right, but I am going to go and tell you about what Max Weber, that same old Max Weber you already read, said about the role of culture in the way he understood it, which was the focus on the role of ideas as they shape people's behavior. So this is only one way of thinking about culture, but it's a very, very important, influential way. And Weber's book, which I'm going to talk about, The Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism, is one of the most influential books in all of the social sciences, in history, in sociology, political science, you name it. Now, Weber's first point was that people are actually directly moved by their interests, but that your ideas shape what you think your interests are. So it wasn't that Weber thought everyone was an idealist who chose to do, the right thing rather than the self-interested thing. His point was deeper, which is even if you are self-interested and you want to do what's good for you, your ideas will shape what you think that is. So you learn that you have some terrible disease. If you believe in Western medicine, you go to a doctor and perhaps submit yourself to very painful, unpleasant treatments because you believe that will cure you. If you don't believe in that, you go to a neuropath or something and you take, homeopathic remedies, or you build up your strength, or you get a blessing said over you if you go to a church that doesn't believe in modern medicine. So all sorts of your ideas. So all those people want to be healed, but their ideas shape what they do to try to get healed, right? And Weber used a metaphor that is very influential. So, and I didn't want to drag the book to class, so I stuck this slide in. This is from an essay by Weber called The Social Psychology of the World Religions, and it's one of the most famous sentences in social science. Weber says, not ideas, but material and ideal interests directly govern men's, he means people's, conduct. Yet very frequently, the world images that have been created by ideas have, like switchmen, determined the tracks along which action has been pushed by the dynamic of interest. From what and for what one wished to be redeemed, and let us not forget, could be redeemed, depended on one's image of the world. Okay, so what did he mean by that? What is the switchman metaphor? Well, he's talking about the switches on a train track. And the switchman is the person who would throw the switch from one track to another. So the power is coming from the interests. And think of that as the engine of the train. And you have this enormously powerful thing hurtling along. And he's not saying that ideas are more powerful than interests, because, again, the engine of the train is this enormously powerful thing. But which direction it will go can be flipped by one person who could no more lift or shift that train on his own than he could fly to the moon. I mean, it would be impossible. But one person flipping one little switch can send that hurtling engine in one direction or in a totally different direction. And that was how Weber saw the role of ideas. That without being very powerful in themselves, that is, the switch is materially a very weak little thing. Nonetheless, they could direct human activity, which was driven by these powerful needs and interests, in one direction or in a radically different direction. And that's how he saw the world religions. So he thought that all religious life grew initially out of people's desire to be saved from suffering, from death, from illness, from hunger, from terrifying raids by the neighboring tribe or whatever. But that as human beings understood the world in what he would call increasingly rational terms, and what he means by that is as human beings came to see the world as governed by powerful forces that could be understood and propitiated, that is, you could do sacrifices to a god and have a better chance of having rain, or not having your child die, or surviving the next round of plague or something like this. Human beings, he thought, developed an increasingly rationalized view of the world, ultimately understanding the world as created and governed by something like a divinity. And then he said that once you develop that understanding of the world, you have a whole new set of problems. What he called the theodicy, what theologians call the theodicy problem. And that is basically, how could a perfect and all-powerful God create an unjust world? So for people who don't have a conception of a powerful being that controls the world, that created it, the fact that some people suffer and others don't, that innocent children die and evil people live on to rule the world sometimes, doesn't create a problem. I mean, it may create an emotional problem, but it doesn't create a moral problem. But once you have certain fundamental beliefs, which all the great world religions developed, then the problem of suffering and injustice is a huge issue. And I'm not going to talk about this part of Weber's thinking today, but in Weber's understanding, and I think he's right, this unresolvable problem, the tension between the perfection of the divinity and the suffering and brokenness of the world, is the source of continuing theological creativity in every world religion. It is the problem that is never solved. It may be solved temporarily in the work of one thinker, but it comes back again and again and again and again. So he then said that in that situation, religious thinkers, and he didn't think ordinary believers worried about these problems very much, but religious specialists, the monks in medieval Catholic abbeys, the people in schools of theology, the religious experts in Hinduism, Buddhism, so forth, were constantly bothered by this. And he said that there were really only three what he called logically closed solutions. Now, I will point out that none of the logically closed solutions ever stays closed. But these are constant, he thought that on sort of logical grounds, these things would recur again and again in every religious tradition. And I believe he's right about that. And so the first of these logically closed solutions is reincarnation. That is, if you believe there's a just God, and yet you see unexplained suffering and injustice in the world, one possibility is that it's really not unearned. Because if every human being lived before and has many, many failures in his or her life, then when an apparently innocent person dies, or the very good person gets killed by the, evil prince who, takes over his whole family and, goes on to thrive, you could believe that that person is paying for sins that were committed in another life. And so the system could be rationally closed in the sense that that provides a logical answer. And I have to tell you, this idea that these things keep recurring, I did a lot of interviews in the early 1970s, no, late 1970s, early 1980s, with pastors. And I was interviewing very, very, very nice guy, Presbyterian minister, down on the peninsula, I think in Cupertino or somewhere. And I was talking to him about, his religious philosophy and whatnot. And he said, well, actually, he said, I just can't believe God would throw away a soul after 60 years of struggle. I guess I believe that, you know, people are always trying to be better and they're always trying to overcome their sins and their weaknesses, and I just can't believe God would throw away that effort. So he said, I guess I kind of believe in reincarnation. So for him as a pastor, the help he tried to give people to keep struggling to overcome their failings, their weaknesses, their sinfulness, it just seemed to him that the God he knew and loved wouldn't throw that away. And so he kind of was driven in his own thinking. Now, he also maybe had some kind of touch of hippiedom had, you know, landed on him at some point. But he had kind of, for himself, he needed to believe in something like reincarnation. So that, Weber said, was one logically closed solution. The second one, and this one has created a lot more trouble for Western religions, is what Weber refers to as Zoroastrian dualism. So Zoroaster was a prophet in what's now, he was a Persian, came from the Persian culture area. And the basic theme, I don't know anything about Zoroaster's own thought, but the basic theme of dualism is that there isn't just one powerful divinity. There is also a separate evil spirit. And the evil spirit and the good spirit are always in conflict with each other. There's a war between them. And one reason human beings then pray and struggle and, you know, worship is to strengthen the good power and weaken the evil power. But the evil power is real and independent. And so the bad things that happen aren't due to the good power, they're due to the evil power. Now, within Western religions, this is regarded as a heresy. That is, you can't believe this. You can't really believe that God isn't all-powerful. But belief in a devil or in some independent source of evil and suffering has in fact recurred again and again and again in Western culture. And it gets suppressed as heresy, but it so fits something of people's experience, which is that they are struggling and struggling to do the right thing, and then some evil part of them or some evil part of the world pops up and ruins everything. And so, again, Weber says it's very tempting to believe this. And again, if you look at particularly medieval Catholicism, there were heresies of this sort again and again. And you know that there are many places that have what amount to devil worship. So the idea is that if there are these powerful forces of evil, then maybe we should make our peace with those, propitiate those, and we'd be better off. So places that believe in witchcraft, of course, have something like this, but many modern cults have a similar quality, and that's why the dominant religions tend to find them so threatening. They don't want worship of the evil forces. They want worship only of the good. Okay. The third logically closed solution, and I have to really use air quotes here, is the doctrine of predestination. And this is the one Weber argues that became so fateful for Western Protestantism. And it is the least logical, but he argues that it was the only solution that fit the Western understanding of God, which is that God was absolutely transcendent, far, far above human beings, far beyond human comprehension, and therefore everything that happened was because God willed it to happen that way, and nothing human beings could do could change it, and most important, human beings were really unable to judge it. So what looks like unmerited suffering, evil, injustice to you was meant to be. And I will say, now you probably don't, I don't know if you follow these things at all, but if you have been following some of these misspoken comments about abortion by a couple of the Republican Senate candidates, the one in Indiana and the one in Missouri, along the lines of, if a rape happens, it's and it leads to a new life, that's what God intended. These things that then afterwards, everybody has to say, oh no, he didn't mean it, that's not what he really said. Well, in some ways, these are logically, I think these particular candidates are working from the fact that they absolutely oppose abortion on any grounds, so they don't want there to be a grounds on which it could be legitimate. But no matter where they're coming from, what comes out of their mouths is the idea that whatever happens is because God willed it. And if you really believe in an all-powerful God, it's extremely hard not to believe that. Now, I'm not saying it's hard not to believe it because, again, all of theology is basically trying to figure out a way to deal with that. So this is from a naive point of view. Okay, so what then does he say about the consequences of predestination in the West? And here you have to look at his analysis, and again, you don't have to learn these dates and you don't really have to learn the names, but the key theological precursors of what he calls the Protestant ethic are Martin Luther and John Calvin. And Martin Luther was German. He actually was a wonderful writer. You can read his work. He's taught in philosophy classes and things. And John Calvin was a French, he wrote in French and was in Geneva, which was its own city-state. So it's now part of Switzerland, but you can actually go and see, I have seen it in John Calvin's own church, which is still there, the chair that he sat in, apparently. I mean, at least I saw a chair and they claimed it was John Calvin's chair. Okay, what was the point here? The point was that Luther was rebelling against the Catholic Church. So this is really considered the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church he opposed is very different from the modern Catholic Church. So those of you who are Catholic, I'm not talking about your church. I'm talking about the church before the Counter-Reformation. And it really was a very different church. But Luther was a monk living in a monastery, and he was trying to assure himself that he would be saved. He was terrified of damnation, as well he should be, an infinity of excruciating suffering with no remission at all. And so he tried to be perfect and to earn salvation. He was a brilliant, and extremely intensely passionate human being, that is, with enormous, I don't know what you call that, natural vitality, sort of physical and mental both. And so when he threw himself into the task of being as pure as Jesus, really being good enough to earn salvation, he did it with a vengeance. And no matter how hard he tried, he could not achieve this. So he tried purifying his thoughts. He tried punishing his body. So when he felt he'd sinned, he would wear hair shirts. He would sleep on beds of nails. He would starve himself. He would fast for days. He would crawl on his knees until they bled. He would pray night and day. He really, and the abbot of his monastery was saying, don't do this. This is really not helping you. Don't do this. But he was insistent that he could feel how sinful he was. So when he tried to purge all his thoughts, he would have dreams at night that were sexual dreams. He would have a nocturnal emission, and he would be horrified that once again he had failed. And he had what we would now call a nervous breakdown, although I think he actually caused his abbot a nervous breakdown because he was, so it reminds me a little of students who occasionally get hung up on their professors. Doesn't happen so much with undergraduates, but graduate students. And the more they love you, the more they want to write a perfect paper. And if they want to write a perfect paper, that means they can't write any paper. So it gets further and further past the deadline, and they've had an incomplete that graduate students can get, and then they still don't turn in the paper. And they're saying, but it isn't really good enough. And you're saying, it's good enough, it's good enough, it's wonderful. fine, done, 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 and they're saying, no, no, it isn't good enough. Well, Luther was doing this with respect to God. Nothing was ever really good enough. And then Luther had a revelation, literally a sort of emotional, huge emotional, what do you call it, revelation. And the revelation was, and it was an emotional, a flood of emotional joy, that salvation didn't come from you forcing God to do something. Salvation came from God's free grace, that God granted salvation. Human beings didn't earn it. God granted it. And that was a complete, it turned his understanding upside down, and then he turned his ferocious energy against the church, claiming that the priests, the rituals through which people confessed and were forgiven their sins, and the Pope were all sacrilegious because they claimed they could dole out God's grace. That's basically what it amounted to. So if you think of him, and there's a great book by the psychologist Erik Erikson called Young Man Luther that pursues this argument that in some sense Luther was in rebellion against authority, but he was in rebellion against the authority of his superior in the monastery by being not hyper bad, but hyper good. And when he was able to transform his experience of God into a totally loving source of grace, then his rebellion, if you will, turned against the church. So he was excommunicated. There was a huge, there actually was a kind of local rebellion. He became the head of a dissident church, which comes down to us today as Lutheranism. Not just due to him, but there were huge wars between countries that became Protestant and those that remained Catholic, and different varieties of Protestantism. But the fundamental insight Luther had, and I want you to think about it this way, is that rather than God being sort of here, so that if you said the right kind of confession right before you died, you could go to heaven, but if the priest didn't get there, if the priest got there 10 minutes late, and you never got to say your last confession, you might go to purgatory or to hell or something, and if you had made a lot of money by exploiting others during your life, but right at the end you donated all that money to found an orphanage in Amsterdam or London, you might be saved, but if you kept the money and you didn't donate it, then you'd go to hell. So a kind of God that was like Santa Claus, kind of keeping lists and deciding who got the goodies, seemed too demeaning to Luther. And so one way to think of it is that he was sort of pushing his understanding of God up to a more transcendent level. But then he was left with a certain kind of irrationality. And I just want to point out, well, I'll make my point and then I'll make my other point. Okay, so the irrationality was that you felt God's grace sometimes, and then at other times you didn't. So what was the believer supposed to do in Lutheranism? The believer was supposed to wait quietly and be ready to accept God's grace when it came. That is, if you couldn't force God, you couldn't say, oh, but I did 10 good things and no bad things last week, so I've earned salvation. But if you couldn't do that, then you really needed to wait, and sort of wait passively. And then Luther had this experience himself that sometimes God's grace came, and sometimes God's grace didn't come. So he would feel abandoned. He would actually feel the devil threatening him. He would feel, oh now I'm going to hell, I know it, and then he would feel another wave of grace. Now my side point here is that some of the most beautiful liturgical music ever written was written for Lutheran churches. Bach was a choral director in a Lutheran church in Germany, which you can actually go visit. And, well, okay, if people need to be ready emotionally to feel God's grace when it's offered, putting them in a sort of transcendent spiritual state through beautiful music is a pretty good idea. So, excuse me, this is bugging me. Yeah, so I'd really like for you to be taking notes. Okay, great, thank you. I can always kind of tell when people are either laughing or distracted or something. So if you're using a computer, I'd like it to be to pay attention here. Okay, so. Okay, so Calvin thought that even Luther's understanding of God was insufficiently transcendent. That is, that this God who sort of swooped down and gave you grace 1 minute and then withdrew the next minute and then swooped down again and made you feel grace was present for you and then went away again, that God couldn't be like that, that God was so transcendent, so above human beings, that God wasn't worried about whether you spanked your child too hard today, whether you read the Bible, whether you read enough verses of the Bible today, and God wasn't swooping down to say, oh, now I'm offering you grace, but tomorrow I'm taking away the offer, so you better, grab it while you can. That in fact, God was so transcendent that the only way to understand God's majesty was the doctrine of predestination. So Calvin's God was a God who was so above human beings that everything in the world was due to his will. Everything that existed, everything that ever had happened or would happen was due to him, and there was nothing human beings could do about it. So the Deus absconditus, Deus is the Latin word for God, and absconditus was the God who had created the world and set it in motion and then stepped away. And that doctrine, Weber argues, was fundamental for transforming Western cultures. What did it do? And here the crucial term Weber develops is this notion of proof of salvation. So the argument is that if everything is predestined from the beginning of time, the most important thing that's predestined is who is saved and who is damned. And everyone is either saved or damned. Calvin believed that most people were damned, that if you looked around you, your own brothers and sisters, your own parents, your own children might well be damned, that relatively few people were among the elect, the saints, that was another term he used, those who were destined for heaven, and that if you were destined for salvation or damnation, there was nothing you could do. Nothing, no human action had any effect on this. Now, this you could argue would be a doctrine of total hopelessness, what Weber calls fatalism. That is, if there's nothing you can do, then party time. I mean, you might as well, right? Might as well enjoy the few years you have on earth before all that eternal torment. But he says that the psychological logic of this was just the opposite, that these were not people who thought it was a joke. They were people for whom eternal damnation and eternal salvation were deadly serious matters. And so the conclusion that their pastors drew was that if you were among the elect, there was nothing you could do to make it happen, but you would see evidence of that in your behavior. You would see proof of your election, and that would show in the way you disciplined your life and it would also show in your work. So your work ethic would show proof of your salvation. And that gave people an enormous motive to work. Not only to work, but to work in a systematic, orderly, rationalized way. Now, I'm going to show you a terrifyingly long slide, at least it's terrifying to me. But Weber argued that this doctrine had enormous consequences that gradually spread to all of Protestantism, not just the sects that shared the belief in predestination. So it becomes part of Baptist belief, of Methodist belief, and why? Because the idea that you will see proof of your election in your behavior, first of all, means that there is an enormous motive to rationalize yourself and to rationalize the world, meaning you want to examine your conduct. You want to know whether you've behaved well or badly. You make lists of the things you've done that are right and wrong. These Puritans, the Puritans were Calvinists, they kept diaries. They systematically ordered their understanding of every aspect of life. And let me point out the difference between what Weber called the original Catholic doctrine of works, and the Calvinist doctrine of proof in a calling. So if you have a doctrine of works, meaning to get into heaven you have to perform good works, then again, it's kind of like Santa Claus in the list. You do a few bad things, but you can make up for them by doing a few good things, and it's kind of like this. And so you say, well, I did a few bad things, but they're not very bad. Lots of other people do worse things. Or I did bad things last week, but I went to confession, I was forgiven, and now I sort of start with a clean slate. For the Calvinist, everything you do matters because it's a sign of what kind of person you are. So even if no one else sees it, if you know that you have done less than you could, wasted time, wasted money, not worked as hard as you could, not been disciplined in your thinking, not been disciplined in your life, that failing is a sign about you. And this is one of the most enduring consequences for us. Now, what are the other consequences? And I'm going to buzz through this incredibly quickly. First of all, Weber argued that once you develop this predestination theory, everything and everyone in the world was now suspect. So a king who's giving you orders because he's always been the king, he's probably among the damned. And he has no right from God. There's no way anyone could know except by his conscientious behavior, whether he is saved or damned. So everything and everyone is subject to the same standard of judgment. And there's no longer a sense that some people are naturally superior to others, some people are naturally better than others. Again, on the one hand, no one can know, and on the other hand, the only indication is that someone rules justly, behaves in a disciplined way, and then that might mean that he or she is among the elect. Second, these doctrines were terrible. They were very hard to live with, they were very frightening, and you imagine a world in which your whole focus is on God, and yet God is so far away you can never communicate with God. And in fact, Puritanism, Calvinism largely suppressed both Jesus and the cult of the Virgin Mary. So, and there were no saints. They got rid of that completely. They got rid of almost all statues and things like that in churches. So something tangible you could feel emotionally connected to, a little medal you could wear around your neck and touch when you were frightened, a statue of Jesus that you could kiss the feet of, or holy water you could have sprinkled on your baby when you thought your baby might be ill, all those things taken away. So in a state of anxiety like that, constant self-discipline was a way of holding yourself together emotionally. That is, you had to act as if you were saved, even in the midst of anxiety and loneliness. And in some sense, disciplined work in a calling was the substitute
for a feeling of intimacy with God. It allowed you to hold yourself together. This very intense self-scrutiny, because again, every piece of your behavior was meaningful for showing what kind of person you were, rational self-control, and finally, disciplined work in a calling, which allowed you to demonstrate the kind of behavior that put you among the elect. And I'll just end by saying, for Weber, this contributed to the development of modern capitalism because it meant that people worked not in order to get rich, but in order to demonstrate that they were saved. And therefore, in the simplest terms, workers worked in a disciplined way so that their employers could get maximum benefit from their labor, and capitalists worked and reinvested their money rather than spending it, because building the business was actually what was important rather than enjoyment. Okay.